Good afternoon. I would like to welcome you to our lecture series, United States in World Affairs, the Cold War and Beyond. I'm Klaus Lares, and I'm the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor in History and International Affairs here at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. I would like to thank Richard Krasno and the generous sponsors behind the Krasno Distinguished Professorship for making possible this lecture series on the United States in World Affairs. I would also like to thank the Department of History and our Center for European Studies for their support. We also have received great help and support from PWAT, the Peace, War and Defense curriculum, and from the College of Arts and Social Sciences, the UNC Arts and Humanities Center, UNC Global, and from TIS, the Triangle Institute for Security Studies. In a little while, the lecture today will be available on our YouTube channel. All our previous talks in this lecture series, as well as our talks in our Ambassadors Forum, will be available on this YouTube channel. The address is youtube.com/KrasnoUNC, and that is one word and with a K. And as you know by now, please watch that YouTube channel as often as possible. We all think it's exciting viewing. Thank you. It is a great pleasure to welcome Professor Carolyn Eisenberg today. Professor Eisenberg is a professor of history at Hofstra University in Hampstead, New York. She actually started there already in the previous century, and she has been there since around about 1999. Carolyn Eisenberg is among America's leading international historians. Much of Carolyn's scholarship has focused on US foreign relations in the 20th century and also on Germany, and thus also on German-American relations. Carolyn is a prolific scholar and writer, and her first book, Drawing the Line, The American Decision to Divide Germany, was received with much acclaim. The book was awarded the Stuart Bernard Book Prize of the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations, Schaeffer. It was also the winner of the 1996 Herbert Hoover Book Award of the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library Association, and it was a finalist for various other awards. Drawing the Line was published by Cambridge University Press in 1996, and it highlights the process of American thinking to divide Germany while trying to blame the Soviet Union for the division of Germany. Carolyn was educated at Chicago, and she received her PhD from Columbia University. And before joining Hofstra in 1999, she taught at Dartmouth College and at Columbia University, and she is actually still involved with teaching and research at Dartmouth College. Carolyn has also published a plethora of articles on, for example, the Berlin blockade and US foreign relations during the Cold War. However, Professor Eisenberg also focuses on the war on terror since 9/11, and she has just finished an article which looks at the transition from Bush to Obama and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. In this context, Carolyn is also a political activist. In particular, she is involved in nationally coordinating legislative work on the war on terror. She often works together with the Congressional Progressive Caucus in Congress, and that is actually one of the largest caucuses in Congress. And of course, the attempts by Congress to get back some power from the executive has already dominated politics in the 1970s. And this is the decade Carolyn Eisenberg will talk to us about today. She has been working on her current book project for almost 13 years. And her talk today will give us the highlights of this massive project, which hopefully will be published in the next couple of years or so. Carolyn Eisenberg will talk about Nixon, Kissinger, and the national security state, Cold War lessons for the post-Cold War world. And as always, there will be time for questions afterwards. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor and pleasure to present Professor Carolyn Eisenberg to you.
Well, hello, and thank you to Klaus for inviting me here. Let's hope I don't destroy all the microphones. It's really a pleasure to be on this campus. I've never been here before. And it's just a wonderful, lovely place, and it gives me an escape from New York. I'm also going to violate everything I think about a good lecture because I have everything written, just because I have so much I want to say in a short amount of time. But I notice that in this room we have a generation gap, right? So half of you will remember exactly what I'm talking about, and the other half of you weren't even born yet. And I'm acknowledging that fact, because if you're sitting here and I'm talking really fast and talking about things where you didn't even exist, and you're losing the thread, just wave your hand or say slow down or whatever, because I'm really here to talk with you. So if I'd given this talk 13 years ago, it's hard to imagine what I would have written. In November 2000, we were already in a post-Cold War world and had been for 9 years. But it was very hard to discern at that time what the overall shape of international relations was going to look like, or even the direction of American foreign policy. So this project that I had begun already on Nixon, Kissinger, and the national security state was not so obviously linked to contemporary concerns. On September 11th, 2001, I was in the first week of a fellowship at NYU's International Center for Advanced Studies, and the whole point of being there was I was supposed to think deeply about this book, and I guess you could figure the fact that 13 years later didn't think deeply enough. But the whole idea was that there would be no significant distractions. So for those of you who know the geography of Manhattan, you can appreciate that NYU is about 20 blocks away from the World Trade Center. And I first realized that something had happened when my phone stopped working, and I was immediately indignant and came rushing into the hall to complain about why doesn't NYU have phones that work. And the next thing we all heard were screams coming from the top of our building because people could actually see the Tower 2 coming down. And we all, from there, walked home to our homes wherever they were because all the transportation was out. The center closed for another week. And for the rest of that semester, as we made our way to NYU building, the remnants of the disaster were absolutely everywhere. Most poignantly in the pictures and the flowers and the testimonials to those who were missing. So here we are, we're 5 scholars, 3 from abroad, Sri Lanka, Italy, Hungary. And we're all confronting every single day this new 9/11 world. And each of us then compelled, regardless of our original intention, to think anew about the relationship of the Cold War to this new reality that was really opening up in front of our eyes. And that state of mind, I think, has never really changed for me. So when I told Klaus what my book was about, and he said lessons for the post-Cold War world, this seemed absolutely natural, because I think that's what I've been writing about mentally, unconsciously for the last 13 years. How does my research about events in 1969, 70, 71, how does it relate to the world that we've inherited? Now, as I sat down to write this, and again, the title of this talk was Nixon, Kissinger, the National Security State, Cold War Lessons for the Post-Cold War, was like a big title. But it doesn't actually specify lessons for who. For us as historians, for policymakers, for students, for people in general, for Americans. So in my remarks today, I want to interpret that question in the latter sense. What are the important lessons that American society might have absorbed that would have been helpful in the post-Cold War world? Okay, so that's really my question. I'm not really just talking about ideas, because I think those ideas that we had or didn't have would have had institutional expression. It wouldn't just be things in people's heads and you take a Gallup poll. So from early in my project, I was struck by a paradox which has elicited the attention of many scholars and journalists, which is how to explain why Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, 2 apparent hawks on the Vietnam War, were also the people who initiated détente with the Soviet Union. And I wanted to better understand how these pieces fit together. So that's really what my project involved right from the very beginning, is sort of looking at U.S. policy in the Vietnam War, U.S. policy towards China, U.S. policy to the Soviet Union, and try to understand how these pieces fit together. Now, on that question of the pieces and how they fit together, in a way, Kissinger himself was way out of the gate on all of these issues. Wrote about these things before anybody else, or certainly not before any professional historians, because everything was classified, and he had all the documents. And so he looked at those documents, took what he wanted from it, wrote all sorts of things, trying to lay out his vision or his interpretation of what has happened. And actually, when you consider the literally thousands of pages that Henry Kissinger has written, his efforts to restrict access to many of his papers by historians, his cultivation of friendly historians, I think it's fair to say that Kissinger's effort to control his own legacy is absolutely unprecedented in its intensity and in its scope. So in my remarks this afternoon, I'm actually going to start with what Kissinger says about how these pieces and how they fit together. And I'm doing that because it really, in many ways, what he wrote and what he said about it has shaped the debate for decades on. And also because a lot of his interpretations have been widely accepted by others without necessarily even knowing, where they originated. And also because his self-presentation has effectively neutralized what might be called less charitable narratives. So let me start. So first of all, if you're getting lost in this talk, I'm just going to spend a couple minutes of sort of the world as Henry Kissinger has explained it, in terms of what happened, how the pieces fit together. So on Vietnam, I don't think Kissinger would accept the characterization of himself as a hawk. As he tells his story, both he and Nixon had an overriding wish for peace. But as leaders of our country, and what they always like to call the free world, although that often included some unfree places, they also had an obligation to honor past commitments and to display credibility. That's a key word here, lest the international order come toppling down. And so as eager as they were for a peaceful solution, the other side was very stubborn. And that created a situation where Nixon and Kissinger endured the agony, and he uses that word over and over, the agony of continuing the war in pursuit of these very important, laudable goals. And for their efforts, they received very little appreciation, if you follow Kissinger, and a lot of irresponsible criticism from others in the elite, many of them people who Kissinger thinks should have known better. By their willingness to continue the war, despite the unfair attacks, Kissinger says, they got Hanoi to the point where it was willing to make a meaningful compromise. And so you got, in 1973, a peace agreement which ended at least the American participation in the war. Now, probably as most of you know, South Vietnam nevertheless was not, quote, saved. And at the time that Saigon fell, a lot of people said, well, the defeat was really because that peace that Kissinger negotiated with Le Duc Tho was really it was very flawed, and that's why it didn't work out. And then some other people who are really sourpusses said, actually, the peace that Henry Kissinger got in 73 could have had pretty much in 1969. And these 2 points, these 2 criticisms, I think actually drive Kissinger crazy, and he's written I don't know how many pages to refute these things. But his essential claim is that the January 1973 peace agreement was a satisfactory one under the circumstances, but that Congress interfered with the administration's ability to enforce it, despite the fact that North Vietnam violated its terms. In his account, Watergate is the big culprit, and the source of a lot of difficulty, because these mushrooming scandals around Watergate, and you all, even you young ones, right, you still know about Watergate. Is that like one thing that's past that? So Watergate is a source of the problem. It made it impossible for the U.S. government to assist the governments of South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, even as aggression overwhelmed them. So again, this is what Kissinger is sketching. Now I want to just stop for a second. I want to talk for a minute about a very, very important link that Kissinger makes when he tells this story. Because an important claim that Kissinger makes is that the administration's firmness in its conduct of the Vietnam War had an extremely important and positive impact on American relations with the Soviet Union and China. That's what he said. And the way he tells the story is that the leaders in Moscow and Beijing were each in their own way foreign policy realists, like him. And they recognized and respected the president's willingness to stand strongly for an honorable peace in Vietnam. They didn't agree with the policy, obviously, but what Kissinger says is they were impressed. Right? They were impressed by Nixon's firmness. And this made the leaders of both nations anxious to strike a deal with the United States, both because they feared our power, but also because they could count on our reliability. If diplomatic commitments were made, they would be adhered to. And this in turn made it possible to open up a whole new relationship with Beijing and to affect the arms control and other agreements with the USSR that we think about as part of détente. So as Kissinger tells the story, there's no paradox and there's no contradiction. All these policies had a rationale and they all work together. Okay, is that reasonably clear? So what are the implications of that? Well, if you believe all of these things, if you subscribe to these propositions, or even if you believe some of them, that it's possible to view Nixon and Kissinger as brilliant strategists. And some of the concerns about Vietnam that people keep bringing up, like the bombing and invasion of Cambodia, or the destruction of the Plain of Jars, the use of napalm, the mining of Haiphong, the Christmas bombing, all these things go into the shadows because they're much less important. And so if you're thinking this way, it really makes sense that 40 years later, here's Henry Kissinger, age 90, on the Sunday talk shows, writing important op-ed pieces. Every important politician goes to get his advice. That includes John Kerry and many other people. It's perfectly understandable why everybody is happy to have this 90-year-old guy so smart, so clever, realistic, sometimes a little mean, why they want his advice. Right? And it's not a surprise that when the Bush White House was trying to decide whether to go to war with Iraq, they went to Henry Kissinger and got his advice. And then when Iraq sort of blew up in their faces, they went to Henry Kissinger to figure out what to do. I'm not saying he was the only person they consulted, but it was considered that he had this wisdom that would really help us in another time of agony. And if you believe all of these things, then it's not surprising that on his 90th birthday, luminaries from all over the country, Democrats and Republicans, gathered together to praise this indispensable statesman. Right? It all kind of fits together. So if these propositions were accurate, actually, we probably should be honoring Richard Nixon too. And if he was alive, and he probably would have been resurrected by now, then we would be honoring him, because what does a third-rate burglary in Watergate stack up against a more peaceful international order which they helped to create? So that's if all these things were true. Now I've spent about 13 years, maybe more, I don't like to admit it, looking at declassified records of this administration. And it seems to me that almost none of it is true. And that a lot of it is just sheer invention, self-serving sheer invention. So let me sketch out as sort of an alternative view of this policy. And I didn't forget about lessons. I want to sort of sketch out for you a little bit a different way of understanding what happened, and then go to lessons, and then it'll be over, and you can ask questions. Okay, but am I talking too fast? Okay. So on Vietnam. So I'm going to give a somewhat different account. Nixon and Kissinger took office at a time when there was already substantial evidence that the war in Vietnam could not be won. Yet the possibility of simply ending it was never on the table. Not for them, and not for any of the relevant government bureaucracies. Now, it is true that Nixon and Kissinger were interested in diplomacy, in getting a peaceful settlement. But what that meant to them was that North Vietnam should agree to withdraw their troops with the Thieu government still in place. Stripped of the details, and there are many details, what they were trying to obtain was a victory at the negotiating table. And since that continually eluded them, their military initiatives were designed to intimidate Hanoi into compliance. Or to simplify this point, really, boil it down, they chose to continue the Vietnam War because they still wanted to win it. However, the political dissent in this country, although not enough to stop the war in 1969, was serious enough that to hold the country, the Nixon administration had to implement a program of troop withdrawals. It was a decision which Henry Kissinger considered a grave error. But in this case, Nixon didn't listen to him because he was the president and he had to think about voters. But of course, once you're on a path of troop withdrawals, then you have a big problem, which is how are you going to win the war with less troops? So one answer, which many of you, will recognize, of course, was to keep building up the army of South Vietnam, Vietnamization. But between 1969 and 1972, it was understood that this was not sufficient. And so a variety of other tactics by the administration were used, stepping up the air war in Laos, saturation bombing in sections of the Mekong Delta, strengthening the Phoenix program. Some of you may not know what that is, so you can ask me in the question. Resuming air attacks on North Vietnam. So all these other things were done as well as building up the Army of South Vietnam. But here's the essential point, and actually this is one of the major ways that I think what Kissinger says and what Nixon says are really misleading. And that is that by 1971, the U.S. effort in Vietnam was failing. It was a policy in ruins. Now there's actually one development that kind of marks that. It's not the only thing, but and we were talking about this. It's something that many of you, how many of you have ever heard of Lamson 719? Okay. So here we're getting to the crescendo. Very, very important. Lamson 719 was launched in February of 1971, and unlike the U.S. invasion of Cambodia, it was South Vietnamese troops going into Laos. Thousands and thousands of South Vietnamese troops, not American troops. Now, the United States was very involved in that whole thing. They planned it, they paid for it, they equipped the troops. American troops actually escorted the South Vietnamese right up to the Laotian border, and then they said, "You guys go over." And there's a momentous thing. I always think about that because I actually was at that very spot on the Laotian border and bought a watch. And so every time I read about this dramatic moment when they're crossing the border and it's so dangerous and the firepower is great, I always think of buying my watch right there. It's very peaceful now, quiet. You can go there, buy watches. But in any event, the American troops accompany South Vietnamese troops to the border. South Vietnamese troops go over. And the United States continues to help them with artillery and with tremendous use of helicopters to move them around, and also planes to do massive bombing while they come. Okay, so that's what Lamson 719 is. And the plan was that they would go in on February, and the South Vietnamese troops would stay in Laos until the end of April, beginning of May. Okay, why? Who cares? Why is that a big deal? Because the idea was that by the South Vietnamese troops staying there and fighting and challenging the North Vietnamese, that it would tie up the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And for those of you too young to remember the Ho Chi Minh Trail, it wasn't really a trail, it was about 100 trails, but it was the path by which supplies kept coming down, men and supplies were coming down into South Vietnam. Okay, it was the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So the idea, right, is that you're going to send these South Vietnamese troops there. They're going to hang around for a couple of months, do their job, kill people, fight, destroy supplies, and so forth. And if you do that and they succeed, what you will have accomplished is you will have prevented the North Vietnamese from carrying out an offensive in the spring of 71 or 72. That you're going to make it impossible for them to conduct an offensive in either of those years. And if you're thinking 72, bing, right, that's a big year because that's the year when President Nixon is going to have to run for re-election. So not having an offensive in that year is seen as a really great goal. But the important thing is that despite all these elaborate plans, the South Vietnamese did not do what was expected. Once their troops encountered significant enemy resistance, which they did, there were thousands of North Vietnamese troops in Laos. So once they encounter significant resistance, the Thieu government says, you know what, I'm taking them out. Too many are dead, people are mad at me, I don't want that. So he orders the South Vietnamese troops to leave Laos. Okay, Nixon and Kissinger go absolutely crazy. Tell them to stay. Kissinger at one point is so mad, he says, tell them we're not going to use the helicopters to let them out. I mean, he's so frustrated and angry. But they leave, okay? And it's horrible for the Nixon administration because it's not an orderly withdrawal, okay? And what appears on television, and here we're going to see the generation gap again, I think, which is what you can see on your television or in your newspaper, is literally these South Vietnamese troops that look like they're running out of Laos, and some of them are clinging to the skids of American helicopters. Any of you remember those pictures? Looks terrible. Okay, and so people look at that on television, you know, they don't know Lamson 719, you know, how many troops did what, boring, whatever, but they can see one thing, right? They can see that the troops are fleeing. And people start to say, all these years, all these deaths, all this money, and the army of South Vietnam is still incompetent and cowardly. And why are our kids dying over there? So that's the situation that is developing at the beginning of 71. I want to say one other thing about Lamson 719. You hear more about that than you ever want. But it's actually important, and it's really relevant to what I want to say in this talk. Nixon and Kissinger did not dream up Lamson 719 by themselves. Like, they didn't sit there and say, wouldn't it be good to go into labs? They were responding to the advice of other people, namely General Abrams in Saigon, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral McCain, who was that's John McCain's dad, who was the commander-in-chief in the Pacific, and General Al Haig, who actually was Kissinger's subordinate, but he's a military guy. And Nixon and Kissinger go to him as a source of great wisdom. And the truth is, when you go back and look at the decision-making process, not only about Lamson 719, but about a lot of the things that Nixon and Kissinger do, what you see is that the president and his national security advisor, and that was Kissinger's title at the time, were placing their stock on military people of whom they were in awe. And I really want to emphasize that, you know, because you read some of these memoirs and, oh, you know, we're in charge and we're making all the decisions. But when they dealt with the military, it's not that they always did what the military said, but they are in awe of the military. They think these are the real men. And that's how they talk to each other, right? A real man. He's a stud. Whatever. So this is, you know, who they listen to. They're listening to their military advisors. Now, having said that, I want to just show you how Lamson 719 connects to Russia and China. Because what I have found in my research is that it had a huge impact on the way in which the United States interacted with Russia and with China. Now, I want to be clear about this. I think under almost any conditions, Vietnam War, no Vietnam War, that what you would have seen is Nixon trying to improve relations with those two countries. Because the relationship between those two countries, the enmity that had emerged, the hostility, was like too tempting to pass up. I mean, this is a phenomenal opportunity. The two communist superpowers are actually fighting with each other. There could even be a war between them. So you're the president of the United States and you see that, well, let's get in there. So I want you to be clear that I'm not saying that it's because of Vietnam that that's why they did these things. Okay, but what I am saying is that because their Vietnam policy was in shambles, that shaped the way that they dealt with the Soviet Union and with China. Okay? Because they needed help. They were the supplicants. Again, very different from what you read in the memoirs where they're in charge. I think they're the supplicants because they want help. Now, they want help in two ways. Okay, one way they want help is they want to get Vietnam off the front pages. Okay, they urgently they want something better to talk about. And literally, if you listen to the Nixon tapes, which I'm sure all of you have a lot of time to sit around and do that. Let me hear a little Nixon. But you listen to those things for the first 3 hours, what you hear is Kissinger, because what's happened in April of 1971 is that the ping pong team has been invited to China. And you literally hear Kissinger say to Nixon, this is it. This is going to take Vietnam off the front pages. We're not going to, 5 months from now, no one will even remember what Vietnam is. Well, that wasn't exactly true. So it's going to be helpful in that way. The second way it was going to be helpful is that it was going to be helpful in that they wanted to get the Soviet Union and China to lean on Hanoi to give them a better deal. Okay, I really want to stop and sort of emphasize. That's partly what they're thinking. They play their cards right, they're clever, that Russia and China will lean on the communist leadership, and then there'll be a better peace agreement, the U.S. can get out of Vietnam, Nixon can be proud, and they'll look like great leaders. Okay. But now look, how do you get the Russians and the Chinese to do those things for you? Why are they going to help you? So that means that you're going to have to hold out concessions to these powers, or you're going to have to at least dangle the possibility of concessions. Okay? I mean, they're not going to help you for love, obviously. So what are those things? Let me just take a pause, let you think about what those things could be. And I want to try to compress this a little bit. So, but just again, I want you to be clear what I'm addressing here is what were they going to do in dealing with Russia or China to get their help with the North? Well, in the case of China, Kissinger starts having secret meetings with Zhou Enlai in the summer of 1971. And we have those transcripts now. Okay? And basically, what you see when you read these transcripts, and again, very much at variance with Kissinger's self-description, other than the fact that you see him insanely flattering Zhou Enlai in a sort of general way. Basically, what he's saying to Zhou Enlai is, you know what? We need a new relationship. We're going to have a new era. He wants the president to be invited to Beijing, which he succeeds in. And he basically tells Zhou Enlai that if you are able to, we move into this new period, we will not support ever an independent Taiwan. We won't support them in their independence. And in fact, we believe they should be reunited with you. We want it to happen peacefully. Don't want you guys to just march into Taiwan and take it over, but we think they should be reunited. And also, if the Vietnam War is over, we think that we will cut our military in Taiwan by 2/3. And there are other things he says to Zhou Enlai in a very similar way. Basically tries to let Zhou Enlai know that from his point of view and Nixon, that really the relationship that the U.S. has with Taiwan or with Japan, much less important than this new moment of this new relationship that he sees burgeoning with the Chinese. So, I mean, that's the tenor of his secret diplomacy. Now, it gets more complicated, but if you don't want to be here for the rest of your life, I'm going to leave it. Okay. Let me just turn quickly to Russia. What are some of the little things they dangle for the Russians? One of the things that they dangle, and actually this they're doing from the very beginning, is Eastern Europe. I mean, from almost the beginning, Kissinger is saying to the Soviet ambassador, you know what, we accept the settlement in Europe. We accept that division. We accept your special relationship, which dominating Eastern Europe. We accept that. We even have ways that we could begin to formalize that. Okay? We just have to have a better relationship. And, over and over, you see in the transcript, Kissinger will say to Dobrynin, you'll hear us talking a lot about Eastern Europe and the liberation of Eastern Europe. Don't worry about it. We don't mean it. I mean, literally, and because we have certain constituents in parts of the country that really care about these things. So you understand there are things we have to say, but it doesn't mean we really mean it. So he's like writing off Eastern Europe even, from the beginning as a little temptation. The second thing is arms control. And I have to say, in preparing this talk, I really feel like I need to talk about arms control, but I've never talked about it when people don't go to sleep. So I almost want you to stretch and say, because I'm going to do it quick and painlessly, but there is a point. Okay, so I apologize in advance. It's a long day. You didn't want to hear about arms control, but it's very relevant to the story. Arms control. The United States, arms control or the SALT agreement is the big game changer in terms of U.S.-Soviet relations. So that's why I'm torturing you with it. And I actually think somewhere in the world there will be a professor who knows how to talk about this and not put everybody to sleep. And I'm going to try. Okay, so getting a nuclear arms agreement with the Soviet Union is absolutely, a sort of high priority. And for the Nixon administration, from the 1969 on, there's a delegation of technical experts who are negotiating with the Russians about arms control, okay, in Helsinki and Vienna. Okay, and the basic American strategy, if I could summarize this in one sentence, is that feeling was the Russians really want to deal on defensive nuclear weapons. They want to deal on defensive weapons. And so let's leverage that and get them to make a deal with us to limit offensive weapons. Okay, and there are different categories of that, but basically the idea you need to have is missiles that will go from Moscow and blow us all up here in Chapel Hill. So let us, that's the basic strategy. Let us try to play on the Russian need for defensive agreement to get an offensive agreement. Okay, and they're negotiating about this. Things aren't going anywhere. Okay, in May of 1971, which, by the way, and not coincidentally, is right after Lamson 719, Kissinger decides that he's going to make a private negotiation with Dobrynin on arms control. They're going to have a breakthrough agreement. And so they do. They make a framework. It's not a final agreement. It's a framework agreement. All right. And the essential thing that Kissinger agrees with Dobrynin is that you're going to tie restrictions on ABM, on anti-ballistic missiles. You're going to restrict those. And what you're going to do is get a freeze on offensive weapons. In other words, you'll be, wherever we are, we're going to stop. Okay, so who could care about that? Well, actually, a lot of people did. Because what the SALT talks were supposed to do was not to freeze, but to limit. Okay, but Kissinger says we're going to freeze, so who cares? Well, the reason that's very significant is because if you're going to do a freeze, and it's going to take a while to get to it all, what's going to happen is that the Russians are going to have an advantage in the number of intercontinental ballistic missiles. Okay, that's what it means to do the freeze rather than a limitation. So I don't know if I lost you on that, but that's a very important, it's a technical point, but it has a lot of consequences. Basically, again, freezing a kind of Soviet advantage, or that's how it was seen. Now, the agreement, they sort of work on this agreement for a long time. In May of 1972, at the summit, again, Kissinger takes over. No arms controllers in the room. Actually, he wants he doesn't even want an American translator in the room because he doesn't want the State Department to know what he's doing. Okay, and he sits down with Dobrynin and they finalize the agreement. And the agreement that they end up finalizing under SALT actually has the Soviets having an advantage in the number of intercontinental ballistic missiles for the next 5 years. It's 800 for us, 950 for the Russians. So a lot of foreign policy hawks look at these numbers and they say, what are you doing? This is terrible. Okay, and suddenly this is the moment, I consider this Kissinger's flower child moment. Suddenly Kissinger says, well, who cares about numbers anyway? You're blowing up the world. How many times it doesn't matter if they can blow up the world 10 times, it doesn't matter. Anyway, by the way, we have MIRV technology and they don't have it. Does everybody know what MIRV technology is? If you don't know, shake your head no. No. Okay. What it means is that you can put more warheads on a missile. So instead of having just one missile to blow up one city, you're going to have 8 warheads and then you can blow up 8 cities. Okay. U.S. knew how to do this. The Russians didn't. So part of what Kissinger said is it doesn't matter that they have more launches because we have MIRV, and in the end we'll still be ahead. Okay. And so that's what he ends up with. And that inequality that I'm describing to you, I'm sorry, I have to put in one more piece. He was wrong. Because the Russians knew how to MIRV very fast. Okay, so in fact, it did freeze that inequality. And that, at that point, all of the right-wingers in the United States say, oh my God, look what they've done. They've given away everything. Kissinger is a traitor. Arms control is terrible. We should never do that. Let's get Ronald Reagan president, and so forth and so on. A lot of writers go on this arms control subject, even though it's so boring. And the tendency to say, well, it was an oversight by Kissinger, it was a little bit of carelessness. Well, I don't think it was any of the above. I think the issue for Kissinger in May of 1972, with the presidential election looming and the Vietnam War mess, was he needed an agreement. And I don't personally feel like it was a bad thing that the Russians had 100 more missiles. I don't want you to hear me saying that, but what I'm saying is from a Cold War perspective, he traded away an American advantage. That's what he actually did. And he did that because their Vietnam policy, I believe, was in shambles. Okay, so I'm going to stop for breath, because I've talked about all these pieces, right? And part of the question is, who cares and how do these pieces come together? And so I want to be very clear with you, and then I promise to get to lessons, and I'll be quiet in 5 more minutes. Okay. Which is, I think when you put those pieces together, what becomes evident is the willingness of both Nixon and Kissinger to abandon long-standing positions and commitments in order to advance relations with the Soviet Union and China. oh, we don't care about the symbolism of who has more missiles. We don't really care about Eastern Europe, so forth, because they wanted to have that improved relationship going into the election. But here we are. This was the very reason why you have the Vietnam War, right? Why are we still fighting in Vietnam? We're fighting to show those communist adversaries that we stand like a rock on our commitment. So you have an absolutely absurd situation where you are bombing Laos, Cambodia, and North Vietnam to show the Russians and the Chinese how formidable we are, while allowing the Russians to know that we're ready to write off half of Europe, and letting the Chinese know we consider our tie to Taiwan not very important. Now, some of you may be sitting here and very curious about, by the way, did it help them in Vietnam? Okay, and it did in one way, because it covered the errors of Vietnam, okay, and it helped Richard Nixon to get reelected, and it made Henry Kissinger a rock star, right? So now this little guy from Fort Washington, a little odd looking and so forth, now he's like an international celebrity, which he is, I guess, for the next 50 years. So it's good for them in that way. But did it give them what they wanted on the war? And the answer is no, it didn't. Now, there is evidence that historians have found in different archives that, in fact, the Russians and the Chinese did say to the Hanoi people, could you be a little more flexible? And there is evidence that people in Hanoi were really upset about this. That's true. Okay? But neither the Soviets nor the Chinese ever came close to doing what would have mattered, which was to cut off aid. Right? If they were going to be serious about helping us, which they weren't, you cut off aid. And the peace agreement that Henry Kissinger got, contrary to what he said, was really, as President Thieu of South Vietnam said, it was a death sentence for the Thieu government. Because in 1973, when the Americans left Vietnam, there were 180,000 to 200,000 North Vietnamese soldiers in the South. And there was nothing that had happened in 10 years that would suggest that the government of South Vietnam could fight alone. And the only real question is, when would Saigon fall? Not if, but when would it fall? So I began my talk about lessons. What are the lessons of all this for the post-Cold War world? And I've taken this long detour because it didn't seem like I could be talking about lessons without saying something about what this national security policy was. But as we turn to lessons, and I hope I can wake you up for 5 more minutes. As we turn to I could say if I had to go to a lecture at 4 o'clock, it would be the worst thing that ever happened. But as we look at lessons, it seems to me the most important point is that in plain sight, and for 4 years, these national security policies produced oceans of suffering for people here in the United States and for people in Southeast Asia. Suffering, in many cases, that hasn't ended even until this day. In the Nixon-Kissinger first term, 20,000 Americans died. 100,000 were wounded. This is their part of the war. Tens of thousands returned to their homes so addicted to drugs and alcohol, so overwhelmed with grief and shame, that many were unrecognizable to the people who loved them, and even unrecognizable to themselves. And as we look at lessons, we need to take very seriously that in those same 4 years, perhaps as many as 1 million Asians died. And for what earthly reason? Killed in the service of strategic calculations that could not withstand any contact with reality. In the name of an abstract notion of credibility, when that credibility was being eroded monthly in the coin of great power diplomacy. Our society has never come to terms with any of it, conceptually or in our institutions. And having failed to learn the lessons of that experience, having failed to learn those lessons, we failed to learn other lessons that might have been helpful to us in responding to 9/11. And so here are a few things that we might have gotten from that earlier experience that as a society we have. A real awareness that our society is not uniquely moral in our dealings with other nations, and that given our power, we have inflicted significant damage on other people. It's not all that we do, but it's some of what we've done. Significant damage on other people. an awareness that our leaders often lie when they describe difficult international situations to the public, an awareness that executive power in our country was dangerously expanded during the Cold War, an awareness that Congress needs to play a much expanded role in addressing issues of war and peace, and that when a country wages an undeclared war, which is what we did then and what we've done now, when a country does that, public accountability and appropriate restraints become difficult to apply. An awareness that the military has acquired a centrality in our society and within our governing institutions that puts our people at greater risk for dangerous and ill-considered activities. An awareness that when you send Americans into other people's country with the purpose of reshaping their societies and governance, that the effect is likely to be tragic for both the people who live there and the soldiers we send. We actually need to ask ourselves, why do we honor today, still, decades later, a man whose recommendations and advice consigned 1 million people to their death for absolutely no good reason. No good reason at all. And ultimately, this question is not about Henry Kissinger, and that's not really the point of this talk. Because I believe that Kissinger's prominence has to be seen as a symptom of a deeper failure, which is our failure to dismantle one of the most pernicious legacies of the Cold War, an over-reliance on violence and military might to solve problems that ought to be addressed in other ways, and a proliferation of institutions that perpetuate these practices. Before we go to bed tonight, some American soldier in Afghanistan may be killed on a mission that we all know is a palpable failure, and still we keep him there. And somewhere in Pakistan or Yemen is somebody's grandmother who's felled by a cruise missile, which is a little bit less accurate than the White House says. And somewhere in Pakistan there is a grandson of that grandma who never thought about this before, but who is now an enemy of the United States. Too many lessons from the past we haven't really learned. And we're still here in 2013 left with national security policies that leave all of us and people elsewhere less secure. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn, for this very emotionally moving and very enlightening talk about America's global strategy in the 1970s. Let me ask you a few questions before opening it.
What am I to do with that microphone?
You can keep it with you. Let me ask you a few questions before opening it up to the audience. Your talk, you said in the beginning, is very different than the talk which would have been given by many other historians. Is that your interpretation based on the documents? Is that your thinking? And how do you deal with these other historians? Tell us whether you have a running fight with some of them.
Do I have a running fight? I have a running fight with Jeremy Soering, who is a biographer of Henry Kissinger, who I always say Jeremy, but I like Jeremy anyway. He's written a Valentine to Henry Kissinger. I don't think every historian does disagree with me, but I think a couple of things. First of all, because I'm so slow writing my book, which I'm about to turn into a virtue rather than a personal failure. One of the effects of that is I have a lot more documents. And I've been filing over the years, mandatory request forms with the government to get more things declassified. So to some degree, it's actually, I have the advantage of slowness, but I think I'm seeing more things. Historians on this question tend to fall out in a number of different ways. So I don't want to say, well, what I'm saying is totally different. But if I was going to really emphasize, and I don't know that this lecture does it very well, but how I think my work might differ from other people, one of the ways that it differs is that I've spent a lot of time writing about the impact of American policy. One reason my book never gets done. In other words, that I think if you are a traditional diplomatic historian, and what you do is you look at what Kissinger said to Nixon and what Nixon said to this person and the Secretary of State said to that person, and I think you should do all of that work. But if you just focus on that and you have no presentation of what happens to human beings when these policies are put into an effect, then in a certain way you're missing the whole point. I've had days when I was in Vietnam where I sometimes thought to myself, just going around Vietnam, that, Henry Kissinger, there's a few things I would like Henry Kissinger to see. And maybe he'd think a little differently, or be a little less self-congratulatory. Okay? One is to see the land of Vietnam, to see places in Vietnam where our chemicals just destroy the land, and there's miles and miles and miles of them. Or to see people who are victims of Agent Orange. Or to go into the tunnels. Because I remember I went into 2 sets of tunnels, which is where the Vietnamese, thousands and thousands of our, quote, enemy lived in those tunnels, many of them from Mont Saint. And I remember thinking, when I was looking at these tunnels, if Henry Kissinger spent 5 minutes in these tunnels and understood what people were doing over there, you really have to stop and think about what you were doing. Both morally, like why do you have to have people living underground for years and years? Of their lives, but also practically, like, how are you going to beat these people, really, who are willing to live underground for years and years because they are so determined to win? I had the same reaction when I was in the Mekong Delta, the southern part of South Vietnam. You go through there and you see the canals and the people, and you're seeing that here's Kissinger and Nixon, and they're making all these pronouncements about the Mekong Delta, and we're going to do this and this unit and blah, blah, blah. And I'm saying, look at the Mekong Delta. It's a place where 1 million people live in the Mekong Delta. There are waterways every which way. But if you don't see it, and you don't imagine it, and every journalist that tries to tell you what's happening, you decide the communist stooge and just out to do you in, or working for the Democrats, then you don't know. And so if I was actually going to say what I think is different about my project and what makes me madder, it's that I spent a lot of time trying to look at the casualties of what happened in the Plain of Jars, of what happened in Quang Tri, of what happened in the Delta, when all these abstract decisions were made. So I think that's a really important thing. The second thing that I've tried to do, and I don't think I did it particularly well in this lecture, but it's a lecture, is that a lot of the writing now really does just concentrate on Nixon and Kissinger and their particular personalities. And probably I just did that same. But in my book, part of what I'm trying to do is to not just look at them, but to look at the institutional network that they're involved in. Because it's not just that the two of them are like the meanest people in the world, or like some days think that, but that's really not the point. But they are embedded in a network of institutions which shapes what they do. So I said in like 5 seconds, rushing in this talk, well, when they come in 1969, half the country is saying, why don't we get out of Vietnam? But in the national security bureaucracies, nobody's saying that. Nobody. They're all still talking about how to win. Or when you look at something like Lam Son 719, again, it's not just them. It's really the military. And what is true about them, and I think this is really interesting, and it isn't one of my preconceptions, is that they are so in awe of the military that they don't ask obvious questions. They don't ask obvious questions. And I can give you lots of examples of that. But part of where I think my work is also different is that ultimately, while I'm very critical of what they did, I think they're embedded in a network of institutions. And I think what makes this work relevant, and why I do think it's connected to now, is we have not dismantled these institutions. We haven't. They're still there. They were there on 9/11. They were there when Barack Obama came in. And if you think, for example, Barack Obama comes in, he's going to get out of Iraq, maybe, right? He escalates the war in Afghanistan. Why does that happen? Why does he do that? I think part of the answer is General Petraeus, the whole Pentagon. He's a new president. He's only been there for 2 minutes. They're telling him he has to escalate. And Gates is telling him, I have to escalate. So part of what I'm saying is that there's an institutional foundation for these mistakes, and we have not dealt with them in the aftermath of the Cold War, and they have pervaded things in the aftermath of 9/11. Does that
Thank you.
That brief answer?
No, absolutely. Talking about the current administration and your last part about lessons from the Cold War. So basically, if I'm not totally misreading what you've said, there's not much of a difference between Nixon and Obama, essentially. Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm not saying that. I think that really isn't what I'm saying. In that, I mean, if we're talking about personal philosophy and, you know, what you like to do, okay, I think Obama really is not a war president. I don't think he wanted to be a war president. I think he really did come in because he had questioned Iraq, you know, as something that was very unwise for our society. And I really think that Obama's interest is in finding peaceful solutions to the problems, but solutions that favor the United States. But you know, that's the direction he's trying to mostly go in. I don't want to overstate that either. And that's not true of Nixon. Right? I mean, Nixon and Kissinger both pride themselves on their willingness to use violence. They pride themselves on that. Now, one of the Kissinger sentences that he says over and over, then, yesterday, say it next week, he over and over he says, we're serious people. We are serious people. Likes that sentence. What does that mean? Well, I think if you read that in context from Kissinger, what that means is that we are people not afraid to use violence. We are people not afraid to kill other people. Now, that's who we are. I don't think Obama has that as his value, but I think the decision, for example, to escalate in Afghanistan is an example. You know, I mean, if he had advisors who told him to do something else, he would have been really happy. But he was stuck. He came in, and all of the important people in the CIA, in the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Petraeus, Secretary Gates, Hillary Clinton, you know, they're all saying, you know, you need to win in Afghanistan. We can't afford to lose there. And so I think he was compelled to do that.
Well, there was that recent remark reported by Obama where he apparently said, I'm good at killing, about drone warfare. Do you think that was just something that you shouldn't take too seriously?
Well, I think it was in context. I actually think it was a sort of a sardonic remark. I didn't think it. I didn't hear when I went back. When I first saw it, I said, "Ooh, this is awful. He might as well be Nixon." But then when I actually read the context, I think partly it was a sense of, well, it's turned out that this is what I do. I kill people, you know, and kind of like astonishment of doing. I mean, I don't really, in the end, pretend to know Obama. I know Kissinger and Nixon better because I read all of their secret things every day. You know, but again, I would say they're different personalities. But see, I think part of what is a mistake, and this is actually one way in which my book is going to be very different from Robert Dallek. I mean, some of you will know who I'm talking about. He wrote a big book on Nixon and Kissinger, which is pretty critical. But when you read the Dallek book, you kind of come away and you feel, well, that's because these guys are kind of creeps. They're very unpleasant. And honestly, where he's getting that from, especially if you look at their transcripts of their phone conversations, they're really mean. I mean, that's really, you look at it, these are not nice guys. These are guys that are trashing everybody. These are guys that keep telling each other how smart they are, how brave they are, how much better they are. So you can see all these personality qualities that I don't like. And I think that's what happened to Bob Dallek. He saw this, and then you listen to the tapes, and you hear Kissinger laughing about when you lie. I mean, I remember I'm sitting in the archives and I'm listening, and I hear him laughing about if you lie. Wow. So it's very easy. Oh, that's because they have bad personalities. You know, some of the way we said about George W. Bush is because he was stupid, right? I mean, there was, I think, a very real sense of, well, Bush made all these bad decisions, and that's because he wasn't too bright, and he let Cheney run things, and so on. And I guess my point on this, and it's a subtle point, is it's not that personality doesn't matter. I think it does, but it always needs to be contextualized. You know, in terms of what are the positions that are people in. And again, that's why I think the transition from Bush to Obama was much less dramatic, I think, than anybody thought it would be. Much less dramatic. And if anybody had said Barack Obama would be doing drones, I think, targeting people in other countries and killing them, and he would just be doing that, I think we would have been shocked. But I think that what you're seeing there is the power of these institutions to shape what our leaders do.
Thank you. Robert Dallek has actually agreed to come and talk to us as well, but probably about JFK rather than Nixon and Kissinger. Let's open it to questions from you. A question here, question there. Let's start with you.
Should I be giving this mic to
No, I'll do that. I'll do that here.
Okay.
Yeah.
And am I all right here in terms of
You're fine. Yeah.
question?
Thank you very much, Professor. Of course, there are many counterexamples which, for what you have described, that the institutions are dominant for the Obama administration, for example, because if you, for example, consider the case of Syria, Obama was actually the only one in his administration who was not in favor of intervention. Hillary Clinton was in favor, Joe Biden was in favor, and so on and so forth. And also, if you see the action against Osama bin Laden, there was a lot of disagreements. So Obama seems to have his own personal judgment. At the end of the day, each drone strike is approved by the President of the United States of America, and he can dismiss every secretary who is not loyal to him. So I'm not sure whether I agree on that. But I have a question about Nixon and Kissinger. I'm sorry, I'm already talking way too long.
Give a long lecture.
About the Christmas bombing, which you mentioned shortly. You're reading a lot of stuff about how Henry Kissinger sees his legacy on his own. So my question is, if you consider his framework that the world needs to be understood under realism framework, that you can make calculations, that people are rational, that they know what they're doing. How does Kissinger justify this madman strategy of random massive bombings on Christmas, which absolutely contrasts his own position that there needs to be stability, that there needs to be a certain rationality? So how does he justify these Christmas bombings?
Yeah.
That's a good question, and to be truthful, I don't feel like I have the answer 100% accurately. I read through those materials a while ago, so I want to say that with some humility. But I think what is probably true is that he was not personally in favor of the Christmas bombings, but not because he had any problem with bombing people, but because, as far as Kissinger was concerned, he had achieved in October of 1972 an agreement with Hanoi which he thought was adequate and met the criterion that they had sort of set for what would be a good agreement. Okay. And what then happens is they make this agreement, and if I can just for a second so pull other people in, one of the features of the agreement that is a very big deal is that the North Vietnamese have between 180 and 200,000 troops left in the South. Okay, that's not a little thing. The government of South Vietnam says this is a terrible agreement. We don't want it. Okay, and so this is October of '72, just before the election, and so there's an issue for Nixon, but how is he going to deal with this South Vietnamese dissent? Now, Kissinger actually wanted Nixon to just tell you, too bad, that's it, we've been there, over, this deal is done. Okay. Nixon makes a different assessment. Nixon is afraid that he's going to now go into the election with the South Vietnamese government denouncing him as a big sellout. And so Nixon stops the agreement from going through. And so the Christmas bombing, I mean, many people have said, and I think I agree with it, it's part of bombing, to show the South Vietnamese that we have to make a deal. This is going to be the last thing we're going to do for you. We're going to just bomb things. And then we're going to end up in January making pretty much the deal we could have had in October. So, just to go back to your question, I think in that's one of the rare cases where the administration opted to bomb, where Kissinger, really was not happy with that. But, I mean, one of the things that really runs through these records and the tapes is the almost enthusiasm that the two of them have for bombing. Almost enthusiasm, you hear them on the tapes. This will really show them. I guess they're really hurting now. They're really going to feel pain. I mean, this kind of conversation, comes in and out throughout the whole, sort of dialogue that takes place. It's actually very shocking. I remember the first time I was listening to the tapes, I was in the National Archives, and I'm sitting there, and I'm listening, and I guess it was this moment when I hear Kissinger thinking how funny it was that the Americans don't care about My Lai. My Lai was for those of you young folks, was a massacre that came out of maybe 400 or 500 men, women, not men, old people, children, babies, all massacred by the U.S. That happened before Nixon was president, but it came out while Nixon was president. It was a big thing, and people did think that the American public would look at those there were pictures of that massacre, and the people would look at it and be horrified. And so you hear this conversation of Nixon and Kissinger talking to each other, and Kissinger thinks it's very funny that Americans don't care, and you sort of hear him chuckling. And I know the first time I listened to that, I actually was shocked, and I'm not, that naive about things, but it just really, and I think a lot of the conversation and tenor of things is actually pretty shocking. I think that's what happened to Bob Dallek, is that, that he was very startled by some of what he heard.
Thank you. So I have two questions. The first is the stuff you said about respect for the military runs up against the narrative, which I guess is mostly about Johnson, of the civilians running the war and screwing it up, and that's why they lost. So I'd like your comments on that. But the second question is, it seems to me that I'm not sure that I agree with you that the Chinese didn't cut off aid, though I agree with you that I don't think it had to do with U.S. pressure. They stopped delivering. Soviet aid was coming through China, and that was slowed down and often stopped by, I think, 71 or so. I'm not sure about then. And I think the Chinese had their own reasons to be hostile to the Vietnamese, starting at least as early as the Cultural Revolution. And so my question is, could you interpret the same data as seeing this as a pro-Chinese move versus the Soviet Union, in the sense of using them to isolate the Soviet Union, which ends up around support around Kampuchea and later on, and so on, that the Chinese already were hostile to a successful Vietnamese revolution in their own way. So I'm wondering what your comments on that are. Thank you.
These are two really great questions. And again, I can't give completely authoritative answers, especially about the whole issue of the role of the military in the Johnson administration. But part of what I think is present in the Nixon administration, I think that in a way the military is playing a bigger role in the Nixon administration because it's exposed. Right? I mean, there's a difference from just, being a general and you're sitting in Washington and people are saying, well, should we have a war or shouldn't we have a war? Right? And how are you going to feel about that and how important that's going to be to you or not? But, by the time you're getting to Nixon, right, our army had been massively engaged there for years. And they want to win or they don't want to lose. And they have a lot at stake at that point. So I think it's probably the case, and the reason I'm hesitating is really because of my uncertainty about the case of Johnson and that matter. But I think that the military is much more proactive during these Nixon years because of the fact that they already are committed, and in some sense their honor is at stake, their skill, their competence is at stake. So I think that's partly what I was saying. And I think, a little bit that's what you saw with Iraq and Afghanistan. I don't know that the U.S. military, for example, was dying to go into Iraq. Right? There's a lot of evidence that they really weren't. But of course, once you've gone into Iraq and you've lost 4,000 soldiers, lost 5,000 soldiers, then you're in a different situation. And so then you get a General Petraeus and others who are really pushing to stay in Iraq, and you also have what you're getting right now, which is pressure, to remain in Afghanistan despite, unbelievable evidence of failure. So that's question one. Is that a response to the question? On the second question about the Chinese, I don't have the dates right in front of me. I think that you're right that there are periods where the Chinese interfere with the flow of Soviet aid, but I don't think it's so much in this later period, and I'm quite sure that in the time from, let's say, July of 1971 to February of 72, between when Kissinger meets Zhou Enlai to when Nixon goes, they up the level of aid, to the Vietnamese, and their level is pretty high. So I'm kind of remembering that what you're saying is right, that there are earlier times when they actually interfered, but that really is their anti-Soviet, sort of issue. I don't think it's to conciliate the United States. If you're asking, I don't feel that I could say authoritatively, what the Chinese felt in terms of a victory by Hanoi. I feel as though the evidence that I've seen is that they really did support that victory, that was important to them, whatever would come later. I mean, one of the things that I find really amazing, and I was really shocked by this, is, again, when you see these transcripts of Kissinger and Zhou Enlai, and even more absurdly, at a certain point, Al Haig goes to Beijing in January of '71. You look at those transcripts. Is that what you see is this kind of almost a supplicant way that Kissinger is communicating. Endless flattery, which you could just say that's diplomacy. But what's interesting, and again, he can envision that glorious day when the Vietnam War is over and we'll take our troops out of Taiwan and all those kind of things. And almost every time that he says this, the Chinese yell at him. I mean, that's just unbelievable. Like Zhou Enlai says, well, people are dying there. Why don't you just get out? Why don't you just go home? Why do you belong there? Why are you telling me about Metternich in the 19th century when you're in this ridiculous colonial struggle? If you go back and look, and those transcripts are actually available. Again, I know a lot of you don't have fantastic time to sit around reading them, so you have to trust me. But you see over and over again the Chinese making the case that the Americans should just go home, period, and that they're not real impressed by we'll get out of Taiwan if you do this or that. Go home, leave this place alone.
Thank you. Yes, please. No, the gentleman here. Yeah.
So last week's lecture, Professor Schwartz mentioned that after a certain time, that when Nixon resigned, I don't know history the dates that well, but Kissinger also sort of stepped out of office because of the new presidents that came in, and he had his own cabinet and whatnot. And I found it interesting that he mentioned that after that, Kissinger never had a government job at all for the last 40, 50 years, although you mentioned people still go to him for advice for whatever matters. And I found it interesting that there's such a long time that he was such influence on this country, and then after that, he never really was in the limelight anymore, quote unquote, in the government limelight. And I was wondering, I asked him, has the world really changed, in the way that when Kissinger was alive and when he was in the government? The world sort of had a different viewpoint where they needed a person like him, a leader like him, to take care of the problems. But after those 40 years, 50 years, when he's not in office anymore, has the world sort of evolved in that time span? And then with your lecture today, you mentioned that it actually hasn't. There's still parallels from his world and his mistakes and times that still plague us to this date. So what do you view?
I think you're asking me three questions. He didn't. First of all, Kissinger stayed in as Secretary of State into the Ford administration. At the end, he is somewhat discredited by conservative Republicans, and because he's associated with this policy of détente, and he's associated with the arms control agreement. And I said earlier in this arms control piece, which is eye-glazing, that one of the things was that Kissinger had accepted these unequal limits. Right? And so that was a kind of killer for, conservative Republicans, why did you do that? I actually don't disagree with Kissinger in saying, who cares whether they have, 900 launchers and we have 800. I don't think that's great. But but if you accept the logic of the Cold War, in other words, if you're saying, for example, that the symbols are so important, that I'm gonna, have 1 million people die in the name of that symbol, then you know what? Then talk about the launchers. But what, to come back very specifically, at a certain point, the right wing in the Republican Party doesn't like him very much. And then, by the time that you get to, to Jimmy Carter, Kissinger is still so linked to Nixon that you can't quite bring him back, either. So there are always sort of specific reasons why he doesn't come back in. Nevertheless, he continues to exert enormous influence behind the scenes. And do I think the world has changed in lots of ways. So, but is it the world is not made for Henry Kissinger anymore? No, I think that the world fits with Henry Kissinger just fine. And if you think about Iraq, right here he is. To me it's absolutely incredible. You wage 4 years of war in Vietnam. You lose. You kill 1 million people. This is huge. Right? And then, without batting an eyelash, oh, sure, let's go to Iraq. Let's go to Iraq. And just on the matter of influence, we were talking about this, I think, at lunch. When the United States goes into Iraq, one of the things that happens is that a man by the name of Paul Bremer, who nobody had ever heard of before, becomes the head of the occupation of Iraq. Literally the head of it. Sovereignty is in Paul Bremer. Paul Bremer actually promulgates 99 laws for Iraq. Probably meant to know that, but 99 laws from Paul Bremer. Who is Paul Bremer? He is the managing director of Kissinger Associates. Right? How did Paul Bremer come from obscurity to be running Iraq? Because Kissinger recommended him. And actually, I have to say about Paul Bremer, this is one of the very few places where everyone agrees. Conservatives, liberals, radicals, Tea Party, if they know it, right? He was terrible. His activity in Iraq was a disaster for Americans, for Iraqis, for anybody that came near it. But how did he get into that job? Henry Kissinger told Rumsfeld that this would be a good idea to have. Again, this isn't really, again, I don't want to really, make this a point about Kissinger personally. But what I'm really trying to say is that the fact that we honor him, the fact that anybody goes and says, who would you like to appoint to run Iraq? The fact that at his 90th birthday party, Bill Clinton gets up and says, an indispensable statesman. And those 1 million people just go away. Right? And we're not just talking about 1 million dead people, we're talking about kids today in Vietnam who are growing up with horrible, injuries and health problems because of the chemicals that were put there. We're talking about people in every community in this country who served in Vietnam and to this day are still carrying the scars of that war. Every community, just real quick aside, if I can do a quick anything. At our school, we had a event on Vietnam, a symposium. And one of the ideas was to have veterans speak out, have a speak out. And I very particularly, as we organized it, said, let's not go for anti-war vets. Let's go to mainstream vets on Long Island. Let them come and talk and tell their stories. And it was stunning. It was stunning to hear. So this is not anti-war people. They might even vote a Republican. But person after person of my age, 60, start telling their stories and they're weeping. And they talk about their estrangement from their wives. And they talk about their alcoholism. And they talk about their addiction. And they talk about their nightmares. And people are still living with those things. And again, it's not that Kissinger personally was, responsible for all of it, but he was responsible for a lot of it. He participated. That's his wisdom. Why do we think that's wise? And that's what I think is very significant to ask as a society. Why do we go to this person with that history, with that tragedy, and we say, he's a man we need advice from? What does that say about where we are as a society right now?
Thank you. I think Paul Bremer was a former ambassador to the Netherlands before he got picked for that Iraq job.
First of all, thank you for your strong moral position in bringing it into these proceedings. You mentioned the reference to Kissinger as a rock star. Professor Schwartz used the term as well.
You need us together.
I wanted to ask this question before too, and I'll ask it of you. And this is, Richard Nixon saw himself, I think, probably as a rock star, though he may not have said it, with regard to foreign policy making. I don't know whether he saw himself as a strategist as well. But I'd like your opinions based on your reading of all this secret documents. Do you believe at all that they had an equal capability in this area?
They were equal to each other?
Well, and in what way they may have contrasted in terms of foreign policy, and was there strength in, let's say, did Nixon have some strengths in this area that Kissinger didn't have, and vice versa?
Thank you.
That's a good question. I don't entirely know how to answer it because they're so fused. So much of the time, the two of them are so much of a team. I mean, they had a psychological difference, which had some impact, which is Nixon was the president, and Kissinger wasn't. So number one, Nixon is his boss. Nixon has to think about the electorate in a way that Kissinger does not. And also, personally, Kissinger is unbelievably insecure. And many people have talked about this, apart from me. I mean, he's a very, very insecure guy, and he's in all of these feuds all the time. With Rogers, Secretary of State, with Secretary of Defense. He's a little paranoid. He feels like people are undercutting him. He's not sure that Nixon always loves him, and that's true because Nixon gets sick of him. Nixon sometimes thinks that Kissinger inflates his own importance, which is probably true too. So there's psychologically, but I think the combination of the two of them is very, very powerful. And they really strengthen one another. So that even things that are a disaster, like Lamson 719, I'm actually rewriting my chapters on it, so I have it's right in front of my eyes. So it's a mess, it's a disaster, it's terrible. And so on the one hand, Kissinger is saying, oh my God, these South Vietnamese, we can't trust them with anything. They betrayed us. This is a disaster. And then, he talks to Nixon, and then the two of them buck each other up, right? Say, well, maybe it's not such a disaster. Well, we can always sell it to the country. Well, really, and then the Chinese thing comes for ping pong, and they say, isn't that amazing? I have a mystical feeling about it. That here we had Laos, so much suffering in Laos, and not not the suffering of the Laotians, but their suffering. And then, boom, here comes the Chinese thing, and we're in the whole other thing. There's endless amounts of them kind of bolstering each other, and you just see that over and over again. And they always are assuring each other that no mistakes are made. Now, if the question is, are these guys smart? They are smart. I mean, it's not my point that they're stupid, but my point is that they are operating in a framework, and they themselves are the kind of people that are so oriented to military violent solutions to so many problems. And I know that you can say, well, Kissinger negotiates, but underpinned by the use of military power. And their awe of the military makes them stupid. Okay? I mean, and I think we all know that from life, that you often can see people that are really smart people, but they're in something which doesn't bring out their wisdom. It brings out their stupidity. And when you look at Kissinger, I've been reading the transcripts of Kissinger and the Joint Chiefs of Staff on Lamson 719. You look at that and you say, you know what, this guy's really dumb. Well, my point isn't that he's dumb. My point is that military orientation makes him less wise than he ought to be. Yeah.
Last week when we had the talk from Professor Schwartz, one of the points that stood out to me was just that there's such an overabundance of resources and tapes and regarding the Nixon era. And I'm wondering, with regard to legacy and also characterization of Nixon and Kissinger, to what extent we have to balance that overabundance of resources when comparing them to other politicians or the level of militarization or their personal violent natures. To what extent we have to counterbalance that by saying we don't have those types of resources for to really look deeply into the characterization of other politicians.
And if you had that I mean, that's a really good question. If you had that kind of data on other people, would they come out looking the same way? And what do I really think about that? Some of them would. and we have a lot of tapes of, of Johnson that don't necessarily put him in the most flattering light. But I think that these people, I wrote this very long book on the origins of the Cold War, and it's absolutely true that there were not the same sources for the Truman administration, even roughly, that there are here. And I don't really agree with most of the decisions that the Truman administration made, okay? But the tenor of things is different. It just is different. That there's just levels of violent talk and levels of venality. There's times when you listen to the two of them, and you say, well, these are like the boys from Columbine. I mean, they're sitting there, and I have to have a whole long chapter how they talk about all their colleagues. I mean, I keep going to junior high school, right? Really mad kids in junior high. I mean, honestly, they're going systematically from person after person, and what's wrong with this one, and what's wrong with that one, and it's really very primal kind of thing. I think that there's something a little bit unusual about that. However, and I don't think this is a small point, we also need to take account of what they're doing and what they're involved in, right? I mean, in other words, here's these guys, and what they're doing is they are running a war that's already failed. They're running a war that's already killed 30,000 Americans. They're running a war that nobody really has any good idea how in the world you're ever going to win it. And they're getting phenomenal levels of criticism directed at them, and that's a very important point. And when and there is a very strong sense that a lot of elite people, are criticizing them. So, I have to think that some of the toxicity of their relationship partly has to do, with that frame of reference. They're very, very angry that they're not getting more approval from important people. I mean, that's very, very profound in them. And at a certain point, elites, and I include here the business community. When I was a younger person protesting the war, I said everything's due to, corporations. The elite, Kissinger's a tool of the Rockefellers, had all these ideas about. It's not that that's totally wrong, but you can actually see, David Rockefeller saying to Kissinger, when are you going to finish this? People are really upset, Henry. When is this going to be over? Get it over with. And I mean, that's a friendly, that's coming from a friendly source. But I think, I don't think that the personal nastiness can be dissevered from the context of killing, which is really there. And it just gets more and more dramatic all the time, and they have to shut down. They are totally shut down. There's one amazing point after when My Lai is exposed, and there are these pictures in Life magazine of all of these women and babies and horrible, blood everywhere. And Kissinger is talking to the Secretary of Defense about My Lai, and the Secretary of Defense says, Henry, have you seen the pictures? The whole country's seen the pictures. No, I haven't seen the pictures. Do you think I should see the pictures? Henry, they're bad. Well, do I have to see the pictures? And so, what is that? You are the National Security Advisor of the United States. A huge massacre has just been, exposed. And this is the level of things that are coming up. That's partly what I want to say, is that these kinds of stories are coming day after day. And so, you're sort of with it or you're not. And they are really bent on absolutely screening out any level of human suffering. They don't want to hear about it. If I one more example of this, and then I'll stop it. But it's this kind of coming together of personality and circumstance. One of the battles that takes place in 1969 that got a lot. Some of you may have seen the movie. Is Hamburger Hill. And this crazy battle where this nutty lieutenant sends a group of the North Vietnamese are at the top of Hamburger Hill, and he has these men go up and down the hill 9 times, and every time they go up the hill, more of them are dead or terribly wounded, and he keeps ordering them. And then finally they take the hill, and as soon as they take it, they give it up again. So it's really a huge story, like Hamburger Hill. Like, why did these people die? Why did you say, these are your age, these are 20-year-old kids. Why are you putting them up that hill? So, two of the survivors of that experience go on national television, on CBS, and they're interviewed. And when these two soldiers are interviewed, they start crying on television because they're talking about their friends who died. And they just break down and they're weeping. So Nixon and Kissinger, one of them sees this. What's their response? Why the hell are those guys on television? Who let those guys go on television and do something like that? Call up Melvin and tell him that should never happen again. Right? That's the, and so, that's the kind, sort of day in and day out, these kinds of responses, I think, is partly what's happening.
Thank you. Does it make a difference that Kissinger is still alive while Nixon's, of course, dead? Is that one of the reasons we are focusing perhaps more on Kissinger than on the president?
Well, I guess I am partly for this talk, but I would say probably short answer is yes, but I think Kissinger is relevant in another way, which is that because of his writing. Nixon wrote his memoirs also, which is self-justifying, but it's much more self-justifying about Watergate. Whereas Kissinger has been endlessly concerned about, showing that he was a brilliant strategist. So he's written a lot, and I think some of why, my talk has this character is more, response to his ideas about it, because I do actually think his ideas have permeated, way beyond himself. Even people don't even know where they got them. Although he's certainly working with historians. He's met with certain historians every month. So I actually think that it's because of his, endlessly, intellectually putting forward these things. And his books are not stupid. You have to really, take it seriously and think about, what he's saying. And yes, so he's alive. I'm not kidding. Would we today be honoring Richard Nixon? Would we be celebrating his birthday also? Well, at the point in which he died, no, because he was Watergate. But I walk into a class, and you guys who are undergraduates should tell me, but I used to teach some courses on Nixon. I stopped when I got too opinionated. But I go in on the first day, I say, what do you know about Richard Nixon? And everybody says Watergate. And then people who are really on top of it say China. End of discussion. So, in our memory now, that's what Nixon is about. He's about Watergate. And I feel kind of mixed about it, because I think in many ways, what they did with the Democratic National Headquarters and even the, the stifling of the investigation is far less serious than what they did in these other places and the effect that it had.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, there's one final question. Okay, hold on.
This is just
Take the microphone, please.
First of all, thank you so much, and your passion is winning and overwhelming. What? And I'm not a historian, or an academic, but the passion which is so strong and winning in a presentation makes. I wonder if it's a strength in research and balance in putting together an academic report of these times rather than what we would read from someone who wasn't trained historian. How does the passion serve you as a historian, and what dangers does it present to you as a historian?
Thank you.
Good question. I guess what I would say is probably the most relevance of the emotion that you're hearing is, again, that part of what I've tried to do in my research, in addition to reading the internal policy memoranda from all these people and all these declassified everything, again, is to be alert to what actually happens on the ground. What's happening when these decisions are made. And frankly, so it's almost like when I do that part of my work, which is not, what they're all saying to each other in their claustrophobic rooms, but when I'm reading about what happened, for example, in Laos, or reading about the condition in the hospitals in South Vietnam, or those are the things that are emotional. And I think, frankly, that the exclusion of those things from so many diplomatic history books means that who cares? I mean, that the personal significance of it is taken out. I mean, I just know, and it doesn't matter whether it's a critic or a supporter, if I assign a classroom of students a book that's just about this high-level diplomacy, that's all it's about, people get really bored. Because why do you care? Why do you care what Laird said to Rogers, who says to Kissinger? You know what I'm saying? So, I mean, to me, what makes it an important story is the impact that it had on people's lives, and that's and the emotion that you're hearing is actually not so much my 1970s emotion, which is still also there too, but is really, having spent years now reading about some of the consequences of this. And sometimes it's so difficult and so painful to read about it, what actually happens in some of these places, that you almost feel like you're getting post-traumatic stress just looking at. So, if you're wondering a little bit, where's all that energy coming from and that sense of outrage, it's partly because that's an important part of what I do is really looking at that. Do you start doing research with certain views? Yes. But I actually started with a lot of questions. It wasn't a book about proving that Vietnam was a bad war. I mean, I'm settled on that. And I settled that 40 years ago. But that's not really what I really wanted to understand: how it happened, why it happened. I wanted to understand how Vietnam fit with the relationship with China and the Soviet Union. I wanted to understand what were the processes by which this took place. I wanted to understand what role protest had, now that we can look at the records. So those are real questions. And I've tried as much as possible. I can't say I've succeeded all the time, but to be open-minded. And I really changed my mind about things. It's somewhat where the evidence leads me. So I don't know if that's an answer or not. But I'm not really interested in making a case. I'm interested in understanding what happened. But I would say, and I sort of suggested this in the beginning of my remarks, that sometimes when I look at what's happening now, and I think about what was happening then, I say, oh my God, did we not learn anything? And maybe a way to kind of maybe close this out, when I was in Da Nang, I was interviewing a whole bunch of veterans, and I had a translator. And, these were picked veterans, so they were going to say certain things or whatever, but we're sitting around, we're having this long conversation about Americans, because there are tons of Americans, obviously, in Da Nang, which is where our major base was. So people are telling me things, they have maps, they're showing me things. And then we're kind of going around, and all of a sudden I see that one man has started sobbing. What happened? What he had just said was, these soldiers came to my house, and my father walked in the front of my house, and they shot him in the head. And that was when he broke into tears. And I could pick up the newspaper yesterday. What are they fighting about with cars up? The right of Americans to go into people's homes. And I have to say, when I look at that, I mean, obviously there's one person in Da Nang does not make a whole case. But there are many, many, many cases of that sort. And so when you see that here is Obama, trying to convince the Afghans to let American soldiers go into their homes, I think, did anybody learn anything? Why are we still here? Why are we still doing that? Why don't we understand what happens when you do that? So that's a little of the passion you're hearing too.
Thank you very much indeed.
And thank you for your patience at the end of the day.
Thank you, Carolyn, for a truly enlightening, provocative, and of course highly interesting talk. Thanks very much for coming to us. Thank you for your very many good questions. And I'm sad to announce that this is our last lecture for this semester, but we will start up again in 2014 in January. And actually on the 30th of January, Robert McMahon will come from the University of Ohio State University, and he will actually talk to us about the United States and Asia during the Cold War and after. Until then, have a good festive season. Merry Christmas already, and I'll see you again next year.
Thank